Hi, I'm Linda Rainwater, Training Manager for Baby Lock. I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about putting together the perfect recipe for a basic demonstration on a sewing machine. Most of the time when you're demonstrating a machine, you never really know exactly what it is that your customer wants unless you've had a lot of conversation ahead of time. I firmly believe in relevant selling, which basically means that you're going to address your customer's needs and wants and show them those features on the machine that they're really interested in seeing. But a lot of times your customer doesn't tell you very much until you give them a little bit of something first. And so we want to talk today about how to do that. But first of all, you need to have some things in place in order to make sure that you're ready to go. One of the things that I highly recommend is a good quality thread. If you don't have a good quality thread, primarily what will happen is you could have poor quality stitching. Also, certain types of thread have a little bit of a notch on the edge of it that would prevent the thread from coming off the spool cleanly, which can really impact the way that your machine stitches. So good quality thread, if it's on a wooden spool, it's an antique. Don't use it to sew. The next thing that you'll want to pay attention to is the size of the spool cap that you're using. You know, your thread, as it feeds off of the machine, needs to be able to smoothly glide around. And if your thread is coming up at a big angle, for example, if you use too large of a spool cap on a smaller cone of thread, what will happen is that you'll put a little bit of a strain on the thread, and that can impact stitching. So always check out the size of your spool cap. And lastly, I can't say enough about the right caliber of needle. Most sewing machines come packed with a variety of needles, and you may not even know what those needles are. Sometimes they're a semi-ballpoint needle. Well, you can get away with that in a lot of instances, but frequently your customer is looking for a caliber of stitch that's really going to connote the quality of the machine. And the only way you're going to get a good, perfectly straight stitch is if you use a good quality sharp needle. So I highly recommend a Microtex Sharp or a jeans denim needle, and you can go for a size 80-12, and that should pretty much do it for you. The next thing that you have to have is fabric. There is nothing worse than sitting down to demonstrate a sewing machine and not having all of the supplies that you need to just get going. So here's the things that you need to have in order to be able to do your best job, especially in a basic machine demo. So first, I really recommend a little bit of a lightweight fabric, and this is going to show off the quality of the stitch most of the time for your customers, and this is what they're sewing on at home. Next, a good quality cotton that somebody might use if they're a quilter. They're going to recognize this right away, and more than likely that's what they're going to sew on. You also want to have some good beefy denim. I don't know what it is about Americans, but for some reason we don't think a machine is a good machine unless it can go through a lot of denim. So we're going to show that to our customer. I also think that you need to have some nice wool, and this will work well if you're doing a blind hem, which you definitely want to show. You want to have a piece of knit fabric and some ribbing to go along with it. So we're putting up some of the sizes of the fabric to cut, so you can reference those when you're getting your table ready. A nice Essex fabric, and this is a cotton linen blend that we use a lot of times at our home office, and this is a good fabric in order to be able to demonstrate embroidery or for doing sewing and decorative stitches. And so have that available. That way then you can always use it just about for any machine. And lastly, a nice piece of stabilizer, a cutaway preferably because it's nice and stable. So once you have those things, you're ready to go to the demo. Now that we have all of the supplies in place in order to do a demonstration, let's just talk about actually starting the demonstration. Well, it never fails. You're not sitting in a machine waiting for a customer to come in so you can show them everything that you know. Most of the time, you're in the middle of doing something that doesn't have anything to do with demonstrating a sewing machine. And so I find that most of the time, I have to kind of familiarize myself again with what I'm doing. And the best way to do that is to begin with making sure that the machine is threaded well. And you can do this in front of your customer. Most of the time, it'll help you remember what machine you're in front of, because as you're looking at it, you're now starting to think about it again. But the other thing that happens too is that you can show your customer the ease of threading on a Baby Lock sewing machine. So we'll begin. When I'm showing a machine to somebody, sometimes I'll do something as simple as this. I'll pull the thread over and I'll say, watch how easy this machine is to thread. I'm just going to follow the diagram that's actually on the machine. So I'm going to bring it down around the check spring, that's number 2, up and over the take-up lever, that's 3. Now I'm going to go down here to 4. I'm going to tuck my thread behind the thread guide right here, and then I'm going to lower my presser foot. Now the reason you do this is because now your thread stops. If you have this presser foot up, it's easy for the thread to just keep advancing, and then it's a little hard to use a built-in needle threader if there is one. In the instance of the Anna, I don't have a built-in needle threader, and so I'm going to thread the machine manually. Did you notice how I held my scissors at a little bit of an angle? Well, I did that because it's a little bit easier to thread your needle if you've cut your thread at the slightest angle. The next thing that I'm going to do is make sure that I've got a full bobbin. You know, I've seen stores, I've seen people, and I've actually seen some people do it myself. They'll put a couple different colors of thread on top of each other. That's a big no-no. You don't want your customer to do that either. So make sure that if you don't have a lot of thread, pull the rest of it off and then put new thread on. So you're going to wind a bobbin, and in this instance, because Anna is a drop-in bobbin, all I have to do is seat the thread, and now I'm going to take and rotate my hand wheel towards me so I can pull that thread up. Now this is something that I want you to pay attention to, and that is when you're using a manual machine, you have to make sure that your take-up lever is in the highest position so that you know that you've completed one full rotation of a stitch. This is one of the sewing practices that a lot of people don't really pay attention to when they're sewing on a machine, and the frequent complaint is, every single time I start sewing, my thread comes out of the needle or the thread breaks. And that's a pretty sure sign that your customer probably doesn't have the best sewing habits. So once I've replaced my thread cover for my bobbin, I'm ready to start demonstrating the machine. So I like to tell my customer it's very easy to see on my machine all the different stitches that I have. Stitch A is a straight stitch in a center needle position. Now notice that I've got my stitch length at 2.5. I recommend between a 2.5 and a 3 for a straight stitch. Now what you'll do is you'll pick up your lightweight fabric, and the first thing you're going to do is put your presser foot down and make sure you hold on to those thread tails as you get started sewing, and you're just going to sew down here nice and smoothly. Notice that I'm not pulling on my fabric, I'm not pulling it back here, and I'm not preventing it from coming. This is something that most customers, if they've been using an older style machine, they're going to be kind of amazed at, first of all, because they're used to having to really pull their fabric through. So they're going to be impressed with this. Always when you get to the end, rotate your hand wheel until your take-up lever is all the way up, and then you're going to bring this around. It's very nice. And so this is a lot of times where I'll take my first sample and hand it to my customer and say, see how nice that is? Really lightweight fabric. If they've been sewing on an older machine, that right away is very impressive. The next thing I'm going to do is another straight stitch, and this is going to be on a cotton fabric. Now sometimes if you stitch close to the edge to your fabric, you can show off a 1/4 inch seam allowance. But in this instance now I'm going to show off that my machine can sew in reverse the whole time I'm holding down the reverse key. And once again, rotate my hand wheel until it's all the way up. So I can tell my customer at this point it's easy for me to adjust my stitch length by rotating my knob. My machine goes all the way from a 1 millimeter for sewing all the way up to 4 millimeters in stitch length. And this is the piece that really wows everybody. Take a piece of denim, you're going to fold it in half. Now, I have actually heard people say, I can't buy a machine, my husband said, unless it can sew through denim. So you want to make sure that you show the denim, but you got to go a little slow. First thing I do is make sure that your stitch length is on 3. Now remember, we've got an 80-12 needle. It's not the heaviest needle in the world, but if I go slow, I can probably do this well. So I'm going to start sewing on the fabric, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little ramp in my fabric. So see how I'm folding it here? I'm folding it so that I can just glide up this pretty easily. And so as I go through, I'm going to go nice and slow. Once again, take up lever all the way up, bring my threads around the side and cut it, and now she'll be impressed. Probably wants to see a little bit more. I've just demonstrated that my machine can sew on lightweight, cotton fabrics, and denim. And now let's show off some of the other things the machine can do. This is where you're going to grab your Essex fabric and a little bit of your stabilizer, and you can tell your customer some of the things that people like to do when they're sewing on a machine is they might want to do a little bit of a zigzag or some satin stitching, and so you can easily point out that to do that I just have to simply dial in, and I'm following my chart down here. So my B is a straight stitch in the left needle position, so I can take a few stitches like this, and then I can show her that by simply moving this knob, I can now start doing a zigzag stitch, and it'll get wider as I go farther along. Now, in order to be able to show her a satin stitch, I'm just going to take my stitch length and now make it really close together. And so I can show my customer that I can do a nice little satin stitch in case I want to do some applique, and that as I'm doing it, I can either make it wider or narrower. And you don't have to stitch a lot on this, but your customer is going to understand that this is going to give her some capability on the machine. She's probably be able to do some things she maybe wasn't able to do on her other machine. So now you can point out some of the other stitches on the machine. You can say something like, all of the stitches on this top row, well, they're just the basic stitches that are controlled by the stitch length here. But when I go down here into this lower level, those are my stretch stitches. And to get to them, all I have to do is move my knob all the way here so it's in the stretch stitch mode. So this straight stitch now becomes a triple stitch in a center needle position. Same thing here, left needle position, and now I've got a stretch stitch in the left needle position. But I'm thinking that my customer probably wants to do some other things. Now, most of the time, we're having a little bit of a conversation. I want to find out some of the things that she has done, that she wants to continue doing, maybe some of the things that she wants to do that are new for her. I'm also going to find out what type of sewing she's interested in doing. Some people just want to mend. Some people want to really learn how to do something new, like quilting. And you're going to make this relevant for your customers as you go along. Now, for anybody who's a garment sewer, or even if they do home dec, doing a nice blind hem is a great feature on a machine. And so here's where you're going to use your wool fabric. I'm going to slide off my accessory tray, which is going to expose the free arm on the machine. This is where I'm going to be able to take all the accessories that are stored here and explain to her that there's 4 different feet that come with the machine. And that if I want, I can drop the feed dogs in order to be able to do some free motion sewing. I'm going to take my blind hem foot and I'm going to put this on the machine, and this is where I point out these machines all have snap-on presser feet. So I'm going to press the button on the back and release the foot, and now I'm going to place this one on the machine, lining it up. Now, if you can't do this fluidly without making it look cumbersome, practice it. That's what practicing your demo is all about, being able to do something so that it looks really easy. Your customer's going to see you making it easy, and they're going to think, well, maybe I can do that myself. On a mechanical machine, you have to pay attention to the settings that the manufacturer, we recommend inside your instruction manual. It's one thing to select the stitch, and so here I'm going to select stitch E, and I'll tell my customers I'm doing that. I'm going to look for the stitch that I want, and I'm going to line it up here with the knob. And what you have to remember is that your machine is going to set a preset stitch width for all of the stitches on the Anna. Now, to do a blind hem, this is tricky for some. You're going to fold back the fabric like it's the hem, and I'm exposing about 1/4 of an inch. On my machine, there's a little dial that I can move in and out, and what that will do is it will allow me to line my fabric up so that when I'm stitching, it will take a bite in the fabric exactly where I want it to go. So my very first stitch is going to be here. So you always want to line up your fabric with a couple little hand turns like that, and that's okay to do that in front of your customer, okay? So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and sew, and I'm going to explain that what it's doing is it's taking a little bite in the fabric on the left swing of the needle. And sometimes if it's not perfect, well, that's okay, because if I was actually doing a garment, I would test it on a piece of fabric first. So this is our test. So see here, takes a little bite in the fabric. And now when you fold this up, that's kind of a blind hem, okay? If I wanted my stitches to be narrower, this is where I would adjust where I held the fabric. But I'm showing my customers maybe something that they've never done before on their machine. I always think it's a good idea to show stretchy fabrics. And the reason why you do that is a lot of people want to sew on knits and they just don't know how to do it. And so this is where we're going to use some of our stretch stitches. So I'll look for a stitch over here that I want, maybe this little overcasting stitch, G, or I could use it on E. Let's go ahead and use E. So I've got it still on E, and I'm just going to slide this over here to the stretch stitch area. Now for some people, if they're a garment sewer, you could show them how they could take and cut a little neckline out of the fabric. And so what you would do is just take and cut a little bit of a piece that kind of looks like the beginning of a neckline. All right, so that's my piece right here. And now I'm going to take my ribbing and I'm going to fold it in half. And I'm going to put my cut edges and I'm going to line them up with one another. Now I need to have a different presser foot on the machine. I need to go back to my A presser foot. And now that this is in the stretch stitch mode, I'm ready to sew. You're going to take a few stitches And then once you've done that, you can take and line your fabric up. Now the thing about knits is that you can stretch them a little bit when you sew. So you're going to hold your edges together, and then you're going to pull this so that what you have is 3 layers of fabric, the 2 that are the ribbing and the bottom fabric, and you're going to hold them so that they're all together. And I'm just going to sew. If you have to, check and make sure that you're getting all layers at the same time. And there you go. A little bit of a neckline, and it's stretchy too, and your customer needs to see that. Show them how it stretches. The last thing I'm going to do is show how to do a buttonhole on my machine. A lot of people don't do garments, so maybe the buttonhole isn't about sewing on a button for a shirt, but maybe they do some home deck stuff, and there's a lot of pillows out there that are using buttonholes, or you could even use them to make all kinds of decorative things that you can wind ribbon through. There's a lot of reasons to use buttonholes. So when I put this buttonhole foot on, I'm going to line it up so that I can see my red arrow is going to touch one of these lines. So I'm going to put this on the machine, and I'm going to select my buttonhole stitch. So here, I'm going to first go to number 1. So this is a 4-step buttonhole, which means I'm going to do one side, then I'm going to do the bar tack at the bottom, I'm going to sew the opposite side and bar tack at the top. So when you see this, whatever is number 2, well, that means it's the 2nd step. So I know right away that the machine is going to be sewing forward. So I'm going to place my fabric, and I'll use the same fabric I did my zigzag stitching on. I'm going to place my fabric here. Now for a customer who wants to do a buttonhole, most of the time they're going to draw a little line that's going to represent how long they want the buttonhole to be. The last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to put my stitch length here in the buttonhole range. I like to pull my thread up to the top, and so that I'm holding both my bottom thread and my top thread, and we'll start stitching. When you get to the bottom, raise your needle out of the fabric, put it on step 2, let the machine take a couple stitches. Now I'm going to put it on number 3. Machine's going to stitch backwards to do the other side of the buttonhole. And when my red line lines up with where I started it, I'm going to put it on number 4. Finish off my buttonhole, and then I'm done. 4-step buttonhole. At this point of the game, when I've actually shown all these features to my customer, what I'll normally start saying is this the kind of machine you were looking for? If a customer is interested in an entry-level machine, this is a great machine for them. But I like to also ask them, how long are you planning on keeping this machine? Well, what do you think they say? Well, most people say it's the last machine I'm ever going to buy. Okay, fine. If that's the last machine, then why don't we take a moment and look at some of the other machines and what those options are. So here on the Anna, I've shown you all the stitches. There's 15 of them. You have one 4-step buttonhole, and yes, it has a free arm. But when you step up to Molly, what Molly has is now a 1-step buttonhole, 25 different stitches, a built-in needle threader, and adjustable presser foot pressure. In addition to that, I have the ability to select and change my stitch length in addition to my stitch width. Well, that's a big deal because everything's preset on the Anna, but it's not preset on the Molly. So this is where you start doing the compare and contrast and showing your customer the differences between the machines. Well, we've made it easy for you. We've got a resource guide for entry-level machines that are going to show you the step-up differences between one machine and the next. And really recommend that in order to be able to fully demonstrate Baby Lock sewing machines, you really need to get familiar with the product. A basic sewing machine demonstration is just that. It shows off the basics. Sometimes it's harder to do a demonstration on a mechanical machine than it is to do it on a computerized machine. But a lot of times you can do the same demo on all of them. So we're going to take a look at some of those resource elements that we have for you. But you have to practice your game to raise your game. So sit down and start demonstrating to others in your store or every single customer that you get a chance to. And pretty soon, it's going to be as easy as 1, 2, 3. Okay, so now that you've got your feet wet, you've learned a little bit about a basic sewing machine demo, let me call your attention to some of the great resource elements that we have available for you in your stores. Our marketing team has put together a resource guide for our A-line series of machines. Inside of this book, you're going to find an instruction manual for each one of the 9 machines in the A-line, and in addition to that, there's a nice little reference chart that shows all the feet and accessories that go with the machine, and there's a great little brochure that I also want to show you. You notice that when I was demonstrating the machine, I was quick to point out the differences between Anna and Molly, and in doing so, I'm directing my customers' attention to consider some of the possibilities that they could get in moving up the line. Inside of this demo guide, there are a number of different things that you can say about each one of the machines in the A-line that shows the step-up features. If you're brand new to demonstrating sewing machines, you might find it easiest to learn how to do them using machines that aren't as feature-rich as some of our top-of-the-line machines. But once you know how to do a basic demo, it applies for every machine in the line. Remember, find out what your customers' needs are so that you can make the demonstration relevant and personal to them. There's a separate brochure here for all of the machines in the A-line series, and it's not a bad idea to point out the chart in the back of the brochure that will show the different features on the machine so that your customer can see in writing what you've been telling them in person. And lastly, no store is complete without our full line Baby Lock brochure that shows all the different machines in the line. All of these different elements have been put together in order to make your task as showing Baby Lock machines easier than ever. Be sure to visit the Express site for lots of information about all the machines in the Baby Lock line. Thanks for being with me today. Bye.